Okay, we get started. Okay, so we stopped on Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. And in the middle of the page, let me just briefly review and bring us up to speed. About, I don't know, 15 or so lines from the top. There's two dots, Rabbi Tuvia Grauman. We started that last week. And we touched on an interesting subject, and that's the question, when a person has to pay, in this particular case, what the subject is that the shomer, or one of the Daled Shomrim, will make a payment for something that was lost or damaged under his auspices, and the owner in turn will donate or dedicate to him kefel. What does that mean? We know that when a ganef steals something, if he is found guilty by court, and only if he's found guilty by court, he has to pay kefel. We said last week that if he's meida at the very end, there is no kefel. Kefel is a doubling of the value of what he stole. And the subject of the Gemara is that oftentimes owners are risk averse, and they would rather get the value of the object that they gave to the shomer, say shomer chinam, shomer sachar, and give up the opportunity for kefel. So the Gemara started telling us that there is such an opportunity where they can get back just the value of their object, and then they can dedicate kefel to the shomer, so that if and when the ganef is found and he has to pay kefel, he pays it to the shomer, because the shomer has already reimbursed the owner. That's the subject. That's the underlying subject of what we discussed. Now, the question arises, and that was what we were touching on last week. What does it mean to pay the owner? Do you actually have to pay him, or do you have to say, I'm committing to pay you? And that's a very interesting subject, because on the one hand, if he pays him, it's over. He's gotten his money, he can sleep well at night, the owner, and he can say, you know what, I'm now giving you the rights to kefel. I've gotten mine, I'm satisfied, I don't need anything more. And if they find the ganef and he's found guilty and by court, you get the kefel. Okay, that's a negotiation that goes on, and something that the parties have to be willing to do. So then the Gemara asks the question, does that mean he paid him, shilim mamish, or not? So that was the Gemara's question, and it turns out that the Gemara could not come to a satisfactory answer what it meant, whether it meant you had to pay or you just had to pledge to pay. So about, I don't know, 6 lines maybe after the 2 dots, it says, Tana Kavosed Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who established this principle of shilim mamish, or not. And so the Gemara says here, Tana Kavosed Rabbi Yochanan, there's a brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan's view. What's the brisa? Everyone here? Hasocha para mechavero. This is what it says in the brisa. If someone rents a para from his friend, benignav, and it's stolen, and we know that what? That a socher is chayiv in geneva. If it's stolen under the auspices of the socher, he's chayiv in geneva. And he says, "Halo hareini mishalem ve'ena nishba." You know what? I'm not going to swear. I'm going to pay you. Achakach nimsa haganef mishalem tashlumi kefel l'socher. He pays kefil to the socher. So let's look at the language. What did he say? I am going to pay. I'm going to pay. So in other words, according to the strict language here, he's committing to pay that amount to the owner. He hasn't paid it, but he's committing. Says the Gemara that the brisa is a raya, that when it says shilem, it does not mean shilem mamish. Doesn't mean you have to take $100 out of your pocket and actually give it to him. You have to commit to pay. And once you commit to pay, it's as if it was paid for purposes of reimbursement. That if they find the ganef, then that fellow gets kefil, not the owner, but the shomer gets kefil. So that's where we ended up. And we said that even though the Gemara couldn't make a decision, nevertheless, from the Brisa, we see by Socha using the words that the Gemara uses, Halo Hareini Mishalem. There, that's enough. If he says Hareini Mishalem. Okay, so that's kind of where we're winding up, that as to what it means to pay. It means a commitment to pay. Now the Gemara, well, we're going to come back to this discussion, but now the Gemara, in the person of Rav Papa, wants to give us an understanding of how this kefil thing works for all the different shomer. Remember, we have a shomer chinam, a shomer sacher, a socher, someone who rents, and a shoel, someone who borrows and has no financial obligation whatsoever. He's just borrowing from his friend. So the Gemara wants to understand, how will kefil work in all of these situations? In other words, why are they entitled to kefil? Why even the discussion of kefil? Amar Rav Papa, shomer chinam, now a shomer chinam is only guilty if he's careless. If he is careless in the handling of the object, he's responsible to the owner. Short of that, he has absolutely no responsibilities, no matter what happens to the chaypes, the animal, whatever it is. Says Rav Papa, shomer chinam kibin shom prashati. Since he says prashati, maknele kfelo. Once he says prashati, meaning I am guilty, I was careless, then maknele kfelo, if he pays, he gets kefil. Why should he get kefil? He was careless. That's exactly what we're trying to protect from. Says the Gemara, the boy pata nafshi b'geneva. In other words, think of it almost as if he has amigo. It's not, we don't call it amigo. In other words, he has an alternative in his back pocket. And he could say, you know what? This item was stolen. And for stealing, the shomer chinam is not chayiv at all. So there would be no obligation for him to pay. So if he comes and says, prashati, mia culpa, I was careless, and I want to pay for it, says Rav Papa, the Gemara allows him to pay for it, and so to speak, he now buys himself the right to kefil. So this is what Rav Papa is trying to explain to us, is how you get to kefil. How does it happen? In the case of a shomer chinam, because he's chayiv for pshia, he can easily say, I was stolen, I had nothing to do with it, and he would be free. Now that he says pshia, we grant him, and we allow him to pay for it, and he gets kefil. Shomer sachar.
Rabbi,
yeah.
why don't we call it amigo? Sounds like amigo.
Yeah, it sounds like amigo, doesn't it really? I mean, the term amigo, I think, is it's a stronger word, but the implication is the same. Is that he has an alternative or ulterior motive which he could use, which would easily be acceptable. So why they don't use the word migo, David, I can't tell you in the Gemara itself, but it sure smells and sounds like amigo, where it gives him the opportunity to have said something that now, in the case of amigo, I'm just trying to think. In the case of amigo, when you use that principle, are you really shading the truth, or are you saying something that is absolutely not correct? Because, in other words, I had a better theory, and I could have used the better theory, and therefore believe me when I use the lesser theory. Here, yes, it's the same principle, but if he uses the better theory, he's actually not telling the truth. So I'm just wondering that in a standard migo, is it an outright inconsistency, or is it shading the truth where you could get away with it by maybe, I don't know, saying something more aggressive or something different? Here, sure, he could have said Geneva, but that's a lie. It wasn't stolen. So again, it's a good question. I don't know what I allude to it, amigo, And the question is, why isn't it amigo? But the principles are the same. The principle is the same, that he had something better to say, which would have gotten him in a better position by being forthcoming and saying that the emes, he's saying, I am chayiv, and I am going to pay. And Rav Papa wants to show us that that's how he buys his way into kefel, because he's actually going to pay and admit that it was his fault. And again, he says the same thing by the others. Okay, that's a shomer china, shomer safa or a socher, same. Given a nignava, a shomer safa is chayvin geneva, maknelek kfela. He basically is kind of kefel. The boy pata nafshi b'shvura umisa. He could have said, "Oh no, the animal died," and so he's not chayiv or shvura. It broke its leg. It's no longer capable of doing the work. So in other words, again, he's doing the same thing. He could have said something which in emes is not correct. It's not correct, but because he's fessing up to what what he is chayiv for, says the Gemara, that's the way he buys himself the opportunity for the owner to say that yes, I'll take the money. But what that gives rise to is an interesting point. Let's say the soicher says, you know what, this animal died, but I want to pay for it. I'm not mechuyev. I have absolutely no connection to the death of the animal. Nothing that I could have done or was my carelessness or anything else, but I want to pay for it. So the chayra from this Gemara, it seems that we wouldn't take his money because he is outside the scope entirely of what his responsibility is. So if he volunteers to pay, volunteering, again, from what we're looking at the Gemara, does not necessarily give rise to his having the opportunity for kefel. Kefel is a penalty for which the owner is conveying rights based on rights that he has. So the owner has rights here in that for a socher, geneva is an automatic penalty. In other words, if there's geneva, that's exactly what the halacha had in mind when it said that you give it to a shomer safa or a socher, is that there would be a reciprocal penalty for geneva. So if there's geneva, he's chayiv. Says the owner, you know what? I'll take the money. I'm okay. And now, if there should be any kefel, it's your windfall, not mine. But what happens if he doesn't say that? What happens if he says the animal died? So there is no nexus of responsibility anymore between the socher, the shomer safa and the socher on the one hand, and the owner on the other hand, because the owner can't all right, you have to pay me for the death of the animal. There is no liability on the part of a socher for death. So under that circumstance, it would be far more difficult or impossible for the now, could they make a bartered exchange? Can any two people make a bartered exchange and say, you know what, I'm going to give you some money here to take care of a loss, even though I have nothing to do with it, but I want to buy the rights to kefil. Well, I mean, the Gemara doesn't tell us we can't do that, but we're talking the nexus, the halachic nexus, as to whether or not that's something that the halacha would allow or implies, and that can really only be when there is a chiyuv on the part of the shomer, and now he's sort of negotiating his way out, which is why the Gemara says we believe him and we let him do it, because he could have skirted the issue, and instead of saying nignava, he could have said shvura or misa. In other words, that it was not his liability, and therefore he has no liability whatsoever. So it's just an interesting question I'm raising as to whether or not, if it was something that actually did happen, meaning that it died, So that there's no cover up here.
Huh.
I'm not trying to cover it up. It died, and he has no responsibility. But he comes to the owner and says, this animal died. I'm sorry, I don't owe you anything. But you know what? I'm a nice guy. Here's $100 for the animal, and you convey to me kefil. So maybe l'chayri he can do that. Maybe l'chayri he can do that because it's an arm's length transaction outside of the scope of what the Gemara is telling us.
But if a shomer who voluntarily will pay when he's not obligated, sounds like a lifnim mishur hadin situation.
That's l'flim the Shiur Sadin, exactly.
But if he's earning kefil from it, kind of taints the lifnim mishur hadin.
But
Right.
maybe
the
I'm,
Gemara is trying to give us the minimum, not the maximum.
maybe I misunderstood, but when the animal dies, there can't be any kefil situation created.
Exactly.
Well, there can't be any kefil situation.
Unless somebody steals the animal and kills the animal.
It's only but Geneva.
Well, let's think a minute. What happens if someone accidentally, not Begeneva, someone accidentally kills an animal? He accidentally kills the animal, right? He accidentally kills the animal. Didn't mean to, wasn't stealing it, but he did something that caused the animal to die. He fed it poison by mistake, whatever. Is there a chiyuv? Is there a chiyuv there?
Is there a
If you're a shomer,
is there a kefil? Yeah, is there a kefil there? Does it ever, if the animal's dead, how can you create a situation where there's
remember that kefil only happens when the Beis Din adjudicates. If he comes and says, mea culpa, I made a big mistake. I fed the animal some grain. I didn't realize it was poison grain, and I killed the animal. No kefil. We said no kefil. But what happens if in a situation where there is no modeh, there's no, the fellow doesn't take responsibility, and there's an inquiry, and the inquiry shows that he went ahead and fed the animal poison, and the animal died. So now we're penalizing him. Again, we have to look into more detail into the facts to see how that will play out. But I'm just thinking, where could that be? You're right. So the question is, how by Misa could you have kefil? And the potential terrors is that there was something intentional. There was something intentional where Beis Din adjudicated that you were chayiv, and it has to be through adjudication. Can't be through voluntary admission. So
accidents wouldn't create kefil there,
accidents themselves,
or natural dying of the animal or something.
right? And right, and we're going to see in a minute why. We're about to, the next line, talk about that accidents, but in the context of a shoel, in the context of a shoel, in the context of a shomer sachar, who's only chayiv and geneva and aveda, the question is, does Misa trigger kefil? So that's a question we have to think about. But in any event, what Rav Papa is trying to show us here is the nexus between the shomer and kefil. How does the shomer get to kefil? So Rav Papa says the shomer chidin gets to kefil because he says, I am guilty. And he could have said, I'm not guilty by saying something else. The shomer sachar and the sachar, the same thing. They say we are guilty, and therefore we're culpable. And they could have said something else. And therefore, the whole point here is that the owner is willing to take the value of what he gave and walk away and be made whole, and allow the shomer to take the kefil. Now, we're left with one shomer. Who was that? The shoel. So says the Gemara, Shoel she'amar hareini mishalem lo maknele kefela. All right? A shoel who borrows and says, I will pay, we don't give him kefil. Why? Says the Gemara, because this, so to speak, migo doesn't come into effect. Why? B'mai havalela mifta nafshe. In other words, the reason why you're giving him kefil is because he can otherwise exonerate himself. So Shem Chinam and Hashem Masacha can exonerate themselves. Therefore, they're liable to when they admit they pay and they get kefil. With what is the shoel going to exonerate himself? Says the Gemara, right? If you're going to say misa machmas malacha, that it died during the work. In other words, I'm borrowing a cow from you, and I need the cow to pull the plow. And in the middle of pulling the plow, it dies. That's called mesa machmas malacha. Mesa machmas malacha lo shchiach. It says the Gemara that the concept of mesa machmas malacha is so remote, it's so unlikely that you can't hang your hat on that if you're the shoel and say that's my ace in the hole, and therefore I can admit and get kefil because I could have said it died in work. Says the Gemara, no, we won't accept it because that's so unlikely that it dies, while it's working, that we're not going to accept that as a terrorist. So again, from this Gemara, it seems you can't just be a good guy. You can't just be a nice guy and say, I want to pay, take care of the owner, and therefore be entitled to kefil. To be entitled to kefil, there has to be a reason why the owner would convey. And we saw that with Shomer Chinam and Shomer Saka. So when I posited before, what happens if he's Mr. Nice Guy and he wants to pay him anyway, and therefore buy himself kefil? That's not correct. You can't do that. Why? What does it need an excuse? Here, take $100. You have the value of the cow. You're now whole. If something happens later on, you're just conveying kefil to me. The Gemara is saying you can't do that. You have to have had an ace in the hole, a reason to be exonerated, to be free. And instead of being free, you're maida. You're saying, no, I am responsible. And because of that, I want to pay the owner. And the owner, in turn, will transfer to me the rights to kefil. That's what this Gemara is telling us, that there has to be a reciprocal arrangement where there is responsibility. You can't just do it out of thin air because you're nice and I want to pay the guy because I feel bad. That's what the Gemara seems to be indicating, that there has to be okay, so therefore shoel, because the shoel has no sort of fallback, what's he going to say? It died during work? No, we don't buy that. We don't buy that it's likely that it died during work. That is so far-fetched that we're not going to allow you to say that and thereby buy yourself into kefil. That's what the Gemara is saying here. Okay.
Why does the Gemara say it's so rare? If somebody borrows an animal, he may not know exactly how much you can load on the animal to transport stuff. And it's possible that he overloads the animal because he's not familiar with that. Why is it so uncommon that borrowing something?
No, you're right. I mean,
you borrow something, you're not an expert necessarily on what you're borrowing. Just know how to use it.
Right, which is why the Gemara doesn't say it can't happen. It says lo shchiach. It's not likely. Okay, so but your point is, okay, it's not likely, but this guy was a real, he was a shlemazel and he didn't know what to do, and he kept loading and loading and loading, and finally the animal just dropped dead. I mean, can it happen? Of course it can happen. The Gemara is only weighing the fact and saying, as the Amoron, we're sitting around the table and we're advancing this cause. They say, nah, that doesn't happen too often in real life. We're not going to allow that as a teretz for kefil. But can it happen in theory? Yes. The answer is it can happen in theory, but maybe by experience, lo shchiach, it wasn't likely. You're right. I mean,
they could have.
You can never say never. You can never say never.
They could have made an exception to say, if it does happen, even though it's rare, then we allow kefil to occur.
Right. So we'll look at the very next line. The very next line of the Gemara.
I didn't look at it.
It says, what does the Gemara say? Iked Amre, okay, the very next line, there are those who have a different interpretation than what we just said. What do they say? Amarav Papa, Shoel Nami. No, Shoel is not different than Shem Mechinam and Shem Mesachar. Shoel Nami, Kivin Shama Hareini Mishalem, Maknele Kfela. The Iboy, Pater Nafshi, Bemisa Machmas Malacha. In other words, he doesn't buy the theory that Misa Machmas Malacha is Lo Shchiach. That's exactly what we're saying. In other words, so there is an Iked Amre who argues on the first interpretation and says, no, it's equally likely that it died in service for the reason you just said, Jay. Someone overloaded it. The animal had a heart condition, and you just burdened it too much and killed it. So in other words, there is a machloikis now in Rav Papa on the question of Shoel, whether a Shoel is Misa Machmas Malacha is Shchiach or not. And one man de Amar, one version is it's not likely, and therefore he doesn't get kefel. And the other version is it's just as likely as anything else, and therefore he gets kefel. Okay, so that's in fact the machlokes. So take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Maknele kfela niknele kefel kol chiyuve peturei dedalet shomrin." All of the chiyuvim and peturim of the four shomrim yalkina mikroi the common perika shoel, because we have the we talked about it later on in the Gemara. Shoy mechinim yishava alakol imlo posha. So now Rashi is just explaining what we've just said in the Gemara, that the shoy mechinam, he swears that he wasn't it was careless and everything else is okay. But hashol mishalem es hakol, and the shoel has no exemptions. He pays for everything. The two middles, Shem Mesachar and the Seicher, potter min ha'onsen, they are potter from an ones, from an accident, meaning to dies. But for the normal course of Gneva Aveda, they're chayiv. Shoel potter, and what is the shoel potter? Shoel potter b'misa machmas malacha haruyu law, which is appropriate for it, whatever that means. Amalei lahachi oshelisli lo ukma bechilta. In other words, Gemara is making the Rashi is saying a little bit of a little nuance here, is that that it died for work that it was fit. So to your point, Jay, if in other words, if you have a beast of burden, you expect the beast of burden to work. You can't just get be chayiv on the death of an animal if that's the reason why you hire it, why you borrowed it. Listen, I want to borrow your cow because I need to schlep stuff all over the place. I need a heavy animal. I'm borrowing a chicken, I'm borrowing a cow because the cow is going to schlep for me. So if that cow had a weak heart or there was some other problem. Now, if the problem has nothing to do inherently with the cow, in other words, the cow was fit, then and something else happened, then that's a whole different story. But it has to have at least, I borrowed it for the purpose for which it is meant, and therefore I can't be chayiv. Okay, so that's Rav Papa's Gemara. Rav Papa now has given us kind of a baseline as to why kefil applies here. And he's giving us a little bit of an understanding about kefil. Now, says the Gemara, so we have an Iked Amr, we have two views. One, that Misa Machmas Malacha is not Shchiach, and therefore the Shoel is not entitled to negotiate for kefil. And the Iked Amr that says it is, and therefore he's like the other Shomrim and he can get kefil. Now we're going to come, okay, so that was a little bit of a diversion for the Gemara. Now we're going to go back to our initial discussion, which I opened up with, which is the question of when does this responsibility transact? In other words, what has to happen for the shomer to be entitled to the kefil? Does he have to pay? Does he have to pledge to?
We lost you, Rabbi Grauman. You are frozen.
Yep.
funny. Not the one. Omalei Rav Zvid. Omalei Rav Zvid. Comes Rav Zvid and he says, Hochama Abaya. This is Abaya's dictum. Abaya said the following: Shoel, a Shoel, Achi Yishale, until he pays. He actually has to take the money out of his pocket and pay. That's when he becomes that's when the ownership of kefil transfers from the owner to the shoel. Why? The Gemara gives a reason. My tama. Why does he have to pay? A shoel is a very one-sided affair. What is a shoel? I come to you and I say, you know what? Do me a favor. Lend me your ox. Am I paying you for it? No. I'm not giving you anything in value, but you're doing me a favor. So because all the hana is one way, meaning only to the shoel, so we say, if you're going to be entitled to kefel, you've got to do something. You can't just keep sort of leeching off the owner and say, okay, I borrowed from you. Now if something happens, I'll get kefel. So it says the Gemara, you can't just get kefil by saying, I'm going to pay you. So in other words, the theory here is that you already got a freebie because you're a shoel. So if you want to show your gravitas that you really mean it, pay it. So that's the teretz on shoel, that shoel has to be not b'dibura, he has to actually pay. Tanya kavasa de Rav Zvid, and we have a raya from a brisa that Rav Zvid is correct. What is the brisa? Hashoel para mechavero. If someone borrows a para v'nigneva and it's stolen. Now here, watch the words. V'kidem hashoel v'shilein, and the shoel kidem he undertakes to pay. So the word kidem becomes, like we said last week, the word kidem becomes a very important word. And in this particular case, kidem means he paid. Not that he said, oh, I'm going to pay you, I'm going to write you a check. Here it is, I'm paying you. The kidem hashoel v'shilein v'achatak nimtza haganev mishalem tashlume kefel l'shoel. He pays kefel to the shoel. So what does Rav Zvid want to tell us? That from this brisa, it's a raya that you actually have to dip into your pocket, take out the money, the kidem, and pay him. And then the transaction is complete. Then once the owner has something of value, meaning the money, now he conveys to the shoel, to the borrower, he conveys to him the rights to kefil. And that's a brisa. So we've answered, at least for now, we see that by shoel, you need more than just words, not a pledge, an actual payment. Okay, so that goes back to our discussion. Now, says the Gemara, the Lishna Kama de Rav Papa, Vade lo Yehaveh Tiyufta. Okay, now what does this mean? There are two Lashonis in Rav Papa, right? There's the first Lashon in Rav Papa that tells us that Mesa Machmas Malacha lo Shchiach, right? That it's not likely that an animal dies from work, and therefore the shoel has no rights to kefil. And then we have an Ikeda Amr that says, no, that's not true. He has rights to kefil because it is possible. In other words, we're not saying it's so remote that he has no rights to kefil. Now, what is Rav Zvid's teretz? Rav Zvid's theory has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with whether there is a right to kefil because of it's far-fetched or not. He is posing a different theory, and he's saying that you know when a shoel has rights? When he pays. So we're now, forget about shchiach hanai. If he pays, it's good. If he doesn't pay, it's not good. Says the Gemara, L'lishna kama de Rav Papa v'adelai lo tehaveh tiyufta. According to the first version of Rav Papa, that a shoel is not entitled to reimbursement for kefil. Because why? Because it's not shchiach. He has no migo. He has no fallback. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He paid. Once you pay, right, then you take over ownership. So he says, lo hava tiyufta. There's no kasha on Rav Papa because Rav Papa is saying it's not shchiach. Remember, we asked the question, we were amongst ourselves, we were saying, so what happens if he pays anyway? So here you have the answer. The answer is that according to the Brisa, if he goes ahead and takes the $100 out of his pocket, transfers it over to the owner and says, this is for the animal, that he can buy his way into kefil. Obviously, this is a privilege to buy yourself into kefil because you're sort of taking a chance. Says the Gemara, it's not a kasha because Rav Papa has one svara, which has nothing to do with it. But here, so Rav Papa would admit that when you're not paying and it's not shayich that the animal would die, you have no leg to stand on. But if you're paying, then even Rav Papa admits, you know what, you're right. It's not shchiach that the animal will die, but you're paying for it. It's yours. So that's how the Gemara is now saying that the Lishna Kama in Rav Papa is not at odds with Rav Zvid, because Rav Zvid is talking about making a payment. Now, what about the Lishna Basra? Leimet Havati Yufta. What's the Lishna Basra? The Lishna Basra is that it is shayich for the animal to die. It's not as far-fetched as you think. An animal can die machmas malacha. If an animal can die machmas malacha, and he's entitled then to say, okay, I want kefel, then now we have a question. What's the question? The question is, does the Brisa slug up this second view and say, you know what? No, you're not entitled to it because it is shchiach. You're only entitled to it because you paid for it. So now we have a problem. According to that Iked Amre that says that the reason why a shoel gets it is because he has this quote, migo, to say that the animal died machmas malacha, and we accept it, we buy that. Wait a minute. The Brisa says that the only time that he gets it is if he pays for it. Meaning, if he doesn't pay for it, even though he has the migo, he's not entitled to it. That's a kasha. Now you have a kasha on Rav Papa, on that view of Rav Papa that says that he's entitled to it just because it's shchiach. It's not a kasha on the first, because on the first, he's out in left field. It only is because of his having paid. But in the second version, what's the issue? Okay, so now we have a real shaila on that Iked Amre. Is it legitimate? Does it carry weight? Because we're seeing here that the fact that it was shchiach doesn't really mean a whole lot, because we need the Brisa to tell us that he actually paid. So that's the kasha of the Gemara. The Lishna Basra, according to the Lishna Basra, Leimet Yavat Shiyufta. It's a shaila. All right, let's take a look. Rashi. Okay, this is by the show. Below shum schar. We said it's a very one side of the event. B'dibura, the hareni mishalim. The hareni mishalim that I'm paying. Lo makna lehabalim kefel. The balim are not makna kefel. She'en lo shum toiva mutal hoya olav lahaniach dato she'shila lo chinam. In other words, he doesn't give it to him because there was no benefit that he got. We're saying that the only reason why the owner would think to give rights to kefil is because the owner is getting a benefit. But by the shoel, he's getting no benefit. He borrowed it for free. It was totally one-sided. And now the owner is going to go ahead and say, you know what? Pay me and I'll give you kefil. It seems like this whole union of kefil was not such a small deal. In other words, the rights to kefil is something that people vied for. So, because why this whole discussion on the Gemara this morning about how does one shomer get the rights to kefil? It must have been something that they vied for. They want the rights to kefil because to them it's a windfall. So for Shem Chinam or Shem Mesachar, okay, but for the Shoel, which was totally one-sided anyway, because he borrowed from the owner got no satisfaction, the owner got nothing out of it, and now you want me to give you kefel? I'm not giving you the rights to kefel when I realize no benefit whatsoever. So says the Gemara, Lishna Kamader of Papa, Vade lo have it to Yufta. It's not a kasha. Why the name of given the Tamader of Papa Mishum the lo have a lemifta nafshe. He could not be a mifta nafshe. The whole misa machmas balacha lo shechicha. Right. That's what we said. I feel the kodem b'shilem nami yisrael Rav Papa don't laklik fela. So according to this version, big deal. He's going to pay for it. According to Rav Papa, you're still not entitled to kefil. That's what we would think, right? That's what we would say. The tikshale, and then we'll ask the kasha, Havadai lekelo sive the motza omalo ano afapisha omaharene mishalem omre velo omre afapisha shile. So in other words, here is where the rub is if you're going to say I'm going to pay you, you've not induced the owner to do more than you've already done, because he gets no benefit from you. You're the shoel, or it's a one-sided, and you're going to tell me I'll pledge to pay. He says, what do I have from you? But if I give you the money and he has the hard cash in his pocket, now he can sleep at night and say, you know what, farfallen, I have the money, I have the animal, put it out of my mind. Now it can go to the shoel, and the shoel, when he pays for it, then he actually takes ownership. Okay, so that's the thinking of the first version of Rav Papa. But the second version of Rav Papa, name it have it to Yufta, me name it the Shila and Dafka Kama Tana de Brisa. Who says that he actually meant actual payment? So now we have to get to the bottom of it. If he meant actual payment or not. If he didn't mean actual payment, then farfallen. But if he meant actual payment, then why do I need this whole thing of Mrs. Machum Malacha? Rav Papa would agree. Rav Papa himself would admit that if he got the money, then he's whole. If he's whole, then he can convey kefil. Now I have no problem conveying kefil. So that's a tiyufta. So it's a shaila on that second version of Rav Papa. So that's the kasha. So emphatic the Gemara. Omalach Rav Papa. So it comes Rav Papa and he says, Mi ilema mimisnissen. Is the brisa better than the Mishnah? What does he mean? The Tani, because in the Mishnah we said shilei that he pays the ukmina Omar. How do we interpret our Mishnah? We interpret our Mishnah that he says shilei, and we interpreted that the word shilei doesn't mean he's paying. It means I'm going to pay. So in other words, again, it's the nuance of the language. So if the Mishnah says that shilei, and it doesn't mean he took the cold hard cash out of his pocket. It means I'm writing you a pledge. I'm going to pay you. Okay? Hochanami in our brisa, Omar, when it says Omar, when it says that he says, he means that he is going to pay. So what have we said? So in other words, he's kind of backing out, and he's saying that that it's not a kasha. It's not a kasha on Rav Papa according to the Iked Amrei, because when he says paying, he doesn't actually mean paying. He means a pledge to pay. So if it's a pledge to pay, then now we have to fall back to what the Iked Amrei said. The Iked Amrei said that the reason why the shoel is entitled to kefel is because it's shchiach for the animal to die. Now we have to hang our hat on that. Why? Because you can't go to the alternative and say, forget about that. He paid. That's the reason why he gets it. Because according to this version in the Brisa, paying doesn't mean paying. Paying means I pledge that I will pay you. So if you're back to pledging, then that doesn't help. Therefore, it's not a kasha on the Iked Amre, because the Iked Amre are right. Why are they right? Because the only way that the Shoel can get Kefel is if you say that it's Misa Shchiach, that it is likely or possible that the animal will die Machmas Malacha. And if it's possible to die Machmas Malacha, that's his migo. When we use the word migo, that's his migo. So in other words, now we're back to understanding that according to the Iked Amre, in the way Abaya answers this, the way we just answered this kasha, that we're not relying on payment, which would have knocked it out of the box.
Right, relying on shaykhs.
Well, exactly, because paying doesn't mean paying, and this is what
Right, if that's the custom, right, then you're going to say, no, when they said paying, they just meant I'm obligating myself.
I'm obligating myself to pay. Exactly, and that's what's sort of very delicate in this Gemara is because, and even the Gemara will go on further on this subject and discuss when is paying and when is paying just an obligation to pay. So we thought paying meant paying, and therefore it was a kasha on the second version of Rav Papa. Says Rav Papa, no. The Mishnah when it said v'omar, it didn't mean paying. It meant an obligation to pay. So is the brisa stronger than the Mishnah? The brisa also means an obligation. I will pay you. In which case, then the whole thing is up to shluck. Now we're not getting paid. That's not the reason why he's conveying kefel. The only reason why he's conveying kefel is because misa machmas malacha is shchiach.
Right.
I mean, it's a fascinating back and forth how the Gemara is going back. Well, so okay. Okay. So now let's just go a little lighter. Frek the Gemara, mi dami. How are you comparing the brisa to the Mishnah? Hossam in the Mishnah, lokatani kidem. We didn't use the word kidem. We just said that he said it. So that's why we're interpreting that to mean that he paid. Hacha in the brisa, he means the brisa, katani kidem. He uses the word kidem. In other words, the word kidem seems to be the pivotal word here. What does kidem mean? Kidem means he went forward, cut from Kedima. He went ahead. What does it mean he went ahead? Did he pay? Did he not pay? Right? So that's what the difficulty here is. And he wants to say that there's a chilik between the Mishnah and the Brisa in the language itself. In the Mishnah does not use the word kidem. So when it says the word ba'omar, it means he actually forked over the money and gave it to him. Here in the Brisa, it says kidem. What is kidem? Ma kidem, kidem ba'omar. Kidem ba'omar means that he went ahead, right? He went ahead and he said he would pay. And so he went ahead and he would pay, right? So he wants to make a chilik between the Mishnah and the Brisa. You can't compare one from the other. V'omar, and he says, Homidik tani gabi soiche. Right, by soiche. V'omar. So now we're going to make a distinction in the language itself. By soicher, it says v'omar. The gabi shoel kidei. So there's not the same words by socher and by shoel. Shema mina dafka katani. In other words, he's saying no, that because there's a distinction between how we couch the terms of a soicher and how we couch the words by a shoel, we're saying that a soicher can get away with kidem, and I'll pledge it because he has certain other responsibilities. A shoel, because he's literally a freeloader, it's dafka.
Yes, to pay. Yes,
that he has to actually pay because he's a freeloader. He gave nothing. He was at one side of the fair. So the Gemara is explaining to us that the socher and the shomrim have reciprocal arrangements. And once you have reciprocity, that I owe you and you owe me, it's okay to pledge. We believe you. But with the Shoel, there was never any reciprocity. Therefore, it was only one-sided. Therefore, I can't accept that just speaking enough and saying is enough.
So they wouldn't accept the pledge. of
They
the
wouldn't
Shoel.
accept the pledge from the Shoel, right?
But if he did pay, then that
If he did pay,
pays,
then he bought himself the right to
and he's
kefil
in the same category as the
of the socher, right, and the shomer, right. So in other words, the Shoel is kind of on the outs here because he's got a different status entirely. So in order to draw him in and make him similar to the Shomrim, he's got to pay. Okay, whether, in other words, do we believe him? Do we not believe him? The Amoraim, when they sat around and they were looking at this, they said, this is so unfair that the Shoel gets away with borrowing, having no responsibility, and now simply by saying, I will pay, he's now entitled to kefil. As I said, this kefil thing must be weighing heavily that it's a big prize. So we're going to give him this big prize just because he said it? No, he's got to show some mamish, something real. And what's real? Paying for it. Once
He said, if you look, that he pledged to pay with a piece of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Right. Right. Where does he come to say that? Right. The very fact that he has no achrayus, he has no responsibilities here whatsoever,
Right.
rubs us the wrong way. It means that he's a good guy, but he never pledged anything. He doesn't owe anything. He can walk away scot-free. Why would we give him the privilege for kefil just because he said, I'm going to pay? I mean, it's a mindset. It really is a mindset here. Whereas the socher or the shemachinam even, and all of them, they have achrayus. They have responsibilities. Pshia, Yeneva, Aveda. So that has some hard connection. So we say, yeah, when you have achrayus, not so simple. Now, if you say you're going to pay, okay, we're going to believe you're going to pay.
So you can assume from this whole dialogue that the Chachamim believed that kefil really is not uncommon, it is common to end up with
Potentially.
kefil.
Yeah. In other words, it's a big prize.
But
But
it happens.
remember,
It happens a lot.
it has to be, but even the big prize can be whisked away from under him if the guy admits and doesn't.
They're assuming the Ganav is going to be found, and kefil will actually take. They're expecting a lot of kefil cases to happen,
Right.
compared to the other one where they said it was uncommon
Exactly.
to overload the animal or something. That's quite a contrast between what their views were of the two situations.
Right. So, okay. So, okay. So we've come to a stopping point where we see that we have this machlokes, and at the end of the day, we are making distinctions between the other Shomrim and the Shoel, and we have the two versions of Rav Papa which have to be answered. So again, everybody would agree that if you pay, you take the burden away. The question is, if you don't pay and you pledge, how that plays out. So so we're saying that by no problem by the Shomrim, by the other Shomrim, but by a Shoel, you actually have to fork over the money. You have to pull out the money and pay it. It's not enough to make a pledge to pay, because a pledge to pay does not enhance the Shoel's position from where he was before. Paying all of a sudden takes him out from someone who has no achrayus, who was a freeloader, is a Shoel. Okay, takes him out from no achrayus to an achrayus. So the bottom line is, what's the bottom line? That according to Rav Papa, when you have an achrayus, when you have some responsibility, then there can be a reciprocal relationship with the owner, that the owner says, you have an achrayus to me, now I am going to give you, I'm going to give you the privilege of being able to collect a kefil. Obviously, this meant a lot, because otherwise, this is sort of an exercise just in language. You know, he gets kefil, he doesn't get kefil. So like we just said, kefil is a very important thing. And in order to get kefil, you have to do something. So if you do something, then fine, or you have an achrayus. But if you have no achrayus and don't do anything, therefore, according to this, the shoel has to pay, whereas the other showman can just pledge to pay, and we are sufficient.
There's
All right,
one
so
thing,
Mr.
Rabbi, there's one thing that complicates this. The Torah, in many places, treats the shoel not as a freeloader, but as your poor brother who's fallen on hard times, and you are obligated to lend him what he needs.
Right, no, I don't, that's the show, David, you're right. I don't want to disparage him in the sense that he's when I say the word freeloader, I didn't mean to disparage him. You're right. It is your brother who is in need, and if he asks to borrow, you have to give to him. But at the same time, we want to protect the lender. We want to protect the lender so that the lender has something of substance, that it's not just a one-sided thing. So yeah, maybe the word freeloader was a little too heavy here, but
cases, I'm sure there were freeloaders too, but in other places, the Torah makes it clear that if he's fallen on hard times, you're
fallen on a hard time.
Exactly.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean that he has to write over rights to kefil to him. It's one thing that I did a mitzvah because you needed my help and I gave you help. But for me to give you the rights to kefil, not so fast. So you're right. But again, we see that there is a chilik between shoel and the other shomrim, that the other shomrim can get away with merely committing, and the shoel actually has to make a payment in order for him to have those rights of kefil. So, all right. So Mitzvah Shem, we'll pick up from here. Again, the Gemara continues in the next stop. It's fascinating how the Gemara is going to present a number of cases. I really find it really Mitzvah Shem. So in 2 weeks from now, next week is Shavuos. Everybody should be Makabel Matan Torah Ba'ava, and we should have a wonderful Yontif. And so in 2 weeks, Mitzvah Shem will pick up and continue from here.